I want to invite all men on a journey that has to do with why you matter. I know we're living in a day when the importance of men has been downgraded, has been reduced, and in some places totally removed. Appropriate masculinity has gone unappreciated and undervalued. But God is calling men to rise to a whole new level. Remember, God asked Adam a fundamental question. Adam, where are you? I like to say, Adam, where you at? Because this whole future of civilization will be keyed in to fulfilling your God-designed, God-created, and God-given role. So men, it's time to rise up. Over the next number of months, we're going to be challenging men to a new level of manhood, personal, family, church, and cultural impact. And when God's men rise up, things are going to change. When we fail to rise up, as the Bible makes clear, things will disintegrate. So join me. Let's go on a journey together and see what happens when kingdom men rise. Every responsible man here ought to have a will. If you are a man and you have a family, you ought to protect their future. And that comes through having a will. A will is a legal document that says that what you have accumulated in your life, this is how you want it passed on to those that you leave behind. To not have a will is to say, I want somebody else to determine where what I have been able to accumulate, the assets of my existence, I want somebody else to determine where they go, how they are distributed, and where they wind up. But a responsible man wants to be ahead of that and make the determination of where their assets are to go. You see, to create a will is saying you are future-minded. You won't always be here. So you're going to be thinking about tomorrow, today, in your financial or asset planning. Unfortunately, what many do not understand is that there are not only wills of physical assets, there are wills of spiritual assets. What you pass on generationally that has spiritual value attached to it. And unfortunately, many men who don't even bother to pass on physical assets refuse to pass on spiritual assets, one or both, because they're not future-minded. And as a result of not being future-minded, there is chaos in the future because there was not clarity set forth in the present. The Bible has a lot to say about legacy, about what is passed on to the next generation and beyond. In fact, Proverbs chapter 13, verse 22 says, a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. Translation, a bad man leaves no inheritance to his children's children. So if there is no future planning, you cannot be dubbed a good man. Because a good man is not only thinking about what's happening with him today, but what will happen on a 3-generational level. He's concerned about today, he's concerned about his children, and then he's concerned about his children's children, his grandchildren. So a man who's not three-generationally minded, God says is not a good man because he's not thinking long term. He may only be thinking about today as though tomorrow will never come. So every man, all of us as Christians, but specifically to men, a good man has to be generationally minded at least 3 generations long for God to call you good. In Judges chapter 2, verse 10, it says that they grew up a generation who did not know Joseph, who did not know his God. And as a result, chaos ensued. And when you read the book of Judges, you have a culture in perpetual chaos because there was a transfer of the spiritual baton that did not occur. In fact, the book of Judges says, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes because there was no king in those days. There was no standard that had been passed on. Today we live in a day of societal chaos. And that chaos can be rooted back to men who refuse to build a spiritual legacy. Men who refuse to man up to God's requirement for biblical manhood. And like it or not, God starts with holding the man responsible for how the legacy works out or does not. God says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He never says, I am the God of Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel. It's not because he's against the women. It's just that the man was responsible. The whole condemnation of the human race is tied to a man. The Bible says, in Adam all die. Doesn't say in Adam and Eve. Only in Adam, the man, all die. That is because the man was held responsible. So like it or not, want it or not, that's just the way it is. And so we're introduced in this passage of Scripture to a man named Asher. Asher. Let me tell you a little bit about Asher. Verse 30 says, Asher had 4 sons and 1 daughter. Asher was the father of 5 children. And when we end the story of Asher, as you'll see, he comes out pretty good. But he didn't start that way. You see, Asher is the 7th son of Jacob. He is the first son of Zilpah, the 7th son of Jacob. If he's the 7th son of Jacob, that means he's been raised in a dysfunctional family. Because as far as Jacob's family was concerned, Papa was a rolling stone. Wherever he laid his hat was his home. Because Jacob had 12 kids by 4 different women. Jacob created chaos in his family. Asher, the 7th son of Jacob, participated with his brothers in putting Joseph into the pit. So he was part of the conniving group of siblings that wanted to ruin their brother's life. His daddy, Jacob, was known as the trickster or deceiver. He knew how to game. And so he played games all of his life, and that rolled over to his children. So Jacob, the patriarch, created havoc in his family due to his deception. It rubbed off on his boys. His boys destroyed or tried to destroy one of their brothers. He wasn't raised in a good, healthy home environment. It wasn't the kind of environment that would have been inducive to an orderly family structure. There are men here, and since he had a daughter, there are women here who have been raised in dysfunctional families. Well, before you ever get to 1 Chronicles chapter 7, that's Asher. That's his history and his background. It's not a pretty one. It's not to be one to be proud of, but somewhere along the line, there was a transformation that occurred in the life of Asher. Because when we read about him here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we're going to give you some good news. So the good news that I want to give all of us here today, especially the men, but the principle applies to all of us, is that your past doesn't have to determine your future. That no matter how messed up your yesterday was, does not have to control what your tomorrow will be like. That you have an option to change your legacy. And that the legacy bequeathed to you does not have to be the legacy you dispense to others. Whether it is your immediate family, whether it's your siblings, or those who come under your influence. Such is the case with the change and transformation that took place in the life of Asher. Well, let's go to verse 40, because we'll see four things of Asher's impact and his legacy that ought to be true of every man and every head of household who is here. All these, verse 40 says, were the sons of Asher, heads of the fathers' houses. Heads of the fathers' houses. His four boys became heads of houses. They became leaders in their family. Head of a house is a leader of a home. Whatever Asher did when he got right, so influenced his four boys that they were able to take up responsible reins in their own families. It says that his sons became heads of households, that is, leaders within their home, that is, they were willing to own the responsibility for the family. The government's not supposed to raise your children. The neighborhood is not supposed to raise your children. The father in the Bible raises the children, Ephesians 6:4. Fathers raise your children. The man has to own it. He raised his sons to be leaders, to be responsible. As one woman said to her husband, if you're not going to wear the pants, then go to my closet and pick out a pair of mine. That is to own the biblical, responsible role of headship. You say, I haven't seen it. I don't know what it looks like. Then like anything you need to know about, you learn it. But what you don't do is ignore it. Because every man has been called, if he has a family, to operate as head, the responsible person in it. Now, that does not mean you're the most gifted. Your wife may... have greater leadership skills than you. She may have better organizational skills than you. But that has nothing to do with headship. Headship is not the most skilled person, it's where the buck stops. It's the responsible person. So God has given you the office. While you hold the office, you learn the gifts of those for whom you're responsible, and you maximize those gifts so that your office looks good. Headship is responsibility. Headship also involves direction. It involves direction. Whether it's a president or the head of a company or the head of a church or whatever, headship means you are casting a direction so that people know which way we're going. If you're lost and you got folk following you, they're going to be loster. Since they don't know where you're going, they're either going to follow you nowhere or decide they don't want to go nowhere, they'd rather go somewhere, so they create their own vision. To be ahead means that I want to be in close proximity with God so that God can speak to me by his Holy Spirit and give me direction so that those following me will have a place to go. So if God can't give the man clarity, then those following him, Joshua says in Joshua 24:15, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. I'm going to set the spiritual, which is the most important, the foundational, the biblical direction. And what that means is that you're not following the crowd. So you're picking up your cues from him. So Asher recovered in some way, and he raised his sons to be heads of households with fire and vision. If you're going to be the head, you just can't see the acorn. You got to look at the oak. You got to see bigger than what is. Yeah, things are not looking good, but me and God got to get together, and we got to find out how he wants us to fix this, correct this, straighten this, reorient this. Why? Because you just said you the man. You say you the man. Well, if you the man, you got to man up in a responsible biblical way. The second thing we find out about Asher's sons is he calls them choice men. Choice men. That means cream of the crop. Choice men. They weren't run-of-the-mill guys. Somehow in his turnaround, he said, my boys are not going to be like everybody else's sons. My boys are not going to just run with the crowd. I'm going to raise up some excellent choice, cream of the crop boys with one daughter. I'm going to raise them up to be the men that God has created them to be. I'm not going to let them settle. I'm not going to let the boys settle. They're not going to be just like everybody else. They're not going to come in here talking about what my friends say if their friends are wrong. I'm not going to let them hang out with anybody because they're going to be excellent, which means I'm going to give them a standard to shoot for. I ain't going to let social media, I'm not going to let Twitter, I'm not going to let Instagram, I'm not going to let Facebook set my kid's standard. I'm going to raise some choice boys up in here, up in here. There's going to be a divine standard that I give them, that I want to model before them, that I want to teach them, that I want to expose them to. He says his boys became choice boys. High character, high integrity, high standards. The third thing it says about Asher's sons, he speaks in particularly of, he says they were mighty men in verse 40. Mighty men. They were raised to be warriors. Mighty men. Not mediocre men. These are some mighty dudes. They were raised to be warriors. See, you have to understand we're in spiritual warfare here. We're in a war. You now have to fight for your kids. Well, right now, you and I live in a post-Christian era. It's called postmodernism, where the absolute standards of right and wrong no longer apply. So people are making up their own rules as they go along of what's right and wrong. So you better not just send them out to play with anybody. You do have to watch what they're being taught in school. And so he raised warriors. You've got to go to war. You've got to fight. He says he raised warriors, men who would fight, who would battle for his kids, his family, and who would be willing to take the hit. Fight for your kids. Fight for the future. Wage spiritual warfare. You take them before the throne of grace. You take them, you have devotions with them. You pray over them. Go to war. Because the devil is going to war for him. He says he raised his sons to be warriors. To fight for that which was right. And then he says, fourthly, he raised them to be mentors. Because he says, heads of the princesses. He raised them to be mentors. You see, a prince is a king in waiting. He says they were heads of princesses. They were raising future kings. He says they were mentored. They were raised as princesses, that is, positioned for future kingship. And so the question is, what level of mentoring are we giving our kids? And remember, to the third generation, our grandkids. Many a young man has been spiritually castrated because he's not been given a sense of his royal standing in the family and most importantly with the Lord. They've been duped and because there's no godly male figure who loves God, who loves them, who gives them a biblical worldview, and who spiritually imparts to them so that they take all of God into all of life, into all of their world. But the good news is that God can change your yesterday, no matter how messed up it is, and give you a different tomorrow. I know your daddy wasn't there, or he was a bad daddy that was there. I know you've had bad experiences and you've had sins and rebellion. I know all that, but then all you are is just give yourself a name. Call yourself Asher, because you got some dysfunction in your history. But the good news is he shows up in chapter 7 of 1 Chronicles, a brand new man. So your yesterday doesn't have to control your tomorrow. Because look at how this thing closes. It says at the end of verse 40, and the number of them enrolled by genealogy for service in war was 26,000 men. Oh, wait a minute now. We started off with one man, 4 sons, and 1 daughter. But by the time this man got through, he got 26,000 in his legacy that are ready to go to war. See, you just can't be thinking about you. You got to be thinking about the generations behind you, and you got to build yourself an army of men and women. That meant women were in it because more boys were being born, and so you got to build yourself an army. The problem is Satan has been building his army while God's army has been shrinking. So we got to build an army, 26,000 men. You got to have a bunch of folk who take a stand with God and with one another. So what God is looking for are men who want to recover, men who want to get back the dignity that God created you with, who want to fulfill the role that God has given you. In Super Bowl 43, when Santonio Holmes caught the pass that won the Super Bowl, don't forget, 1 minute earlier, he had dropped the ball. Ben Roethlisberger threw him the ball and he dropped it. But then Ben Roethlisberger called him back and said, I'm going to throw it to you again, and this time don't drop it. So if you've dropped it yesterday, you got kids you don't live with, kids you sired that you don't talk to, grandkids that you don't know, okay, you dropped the ball, but God's ready to throw you another pass. And now you got to be willing to catch the ball and move from here. You say, but I wonder whether it's too late. Well, no, it can't be too late, because in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 21, it says that Jacob, even with his grandchildren, recovered because he blessed his grandchildren while he leaned on his staff just before he died. So if it's too late with your kids, get your grandkids so that you reach them and impact them for time and eternity. God is a generational God. He regularly speaks about one generation to another. He talks about, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He talks about a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. God is a generational God, so men must think and function generationally. It's not just about your life, nor is it just about your children. It also includes your grandchildren. When we do not think about cross-generational impact, we're not thinking about legacy. And if we're not thinking about legacy, that means we don't care about the future. We must make our decisions now in light of the generations to come. When we do that, not only do we give ourselves purpose and dignity and impact, we give our names longevity. Remember, legacy is more than a name. Legacy involves the kind of impact you make in the lives of others in such a way that you inspire them through your legacy to build and transfer their own.